They say the earth never forgets. It remembers every footstep, every tear, every secret buried beneath its surface. On certain lands, people swear the ground feels heavier, as if it carries the weight of stories too dark to be spoken in daylight. This is one of those stories. Tonight, you and this voice are going back in time, to a world of plantations and chains, of prayers whispered in the dark, of a woman whose name was erased, but whose decisions echo like a curse across the centuries. She was born without a choice, not into a family, but into an inventory. Not as a daughter, but as a line on a ledger. Her life began in a place where the first thing you learned was obedience, and the second was silence. The plantation stood on a hill, watching over the valley like a stone giant. From a distance, it looked almost beautiful. White walls, columns, a long veranda from which the master could survey his empire. But beauty in that time and place was just another mask for cruelty. Behind the house stretched fields that never seemed to end. Sugarcane, coffee, or cotton, it hardly mattered. What mattered were the backs that bent under the sun, the hands that bled, the voices that sang just to survive another hour. The plantation had no name that survived in the records, but the people who lived nearby much later would call it the land that never rests, because something there seemed always awake. The girl grew up in the slave quarters, a row of cramped huts thrown together with wood and clay. The walls were thin, too thin to keep out the cold, too thin to keep out the sounds from the big house at night. She learned early that there were sounds you pretended not to hear. The slamming of doors, the breaking of glass, the cries that started human and ended like an animal's last breath. In the quarters, she had no mirrors. Reflections came from water in a steel basin, from the faint shimmer of a pot, from eyes staring back in the dark. Others told her she was beautiful. They did not say it as a compliment. They said it as a warning. There is a particular kind of beauty that, under slavery, became a sentence. Her skin was smooth and deep like polished wood. Her eyes were large, almost too large for her face, with a kind of quiet intensity that seemed to see more than she spoke. Her hair, when free from the scarf, curled and coiled like dark smoke. She moved with a grace she did not know she had. Others noticed, especially him. The master of the house was a man shaped by two worlds. In town, before priests and magistrates, he was a gentleman. He donated to the church. He attended Mass. He gave alms when it was convenient. On the plantation, he was something else. The law, the judge, the hand that punished, the gaze that measured people's worth in coin. He had a wife, of course, a respectable woman from a respectable family. Her portraits still hung in the parlor for years after she died. In those paintings, she was frozen, forever in lace and silk, a pale hand resting on the arm of a chair, eyes that didn't not quite meet the viewer's gaze. What the portraits did not show was how quickly she had realized that the man she married did not save his hunger for her alone. The first time he came to the quarters for the young woman, it was like a storm walking on two legs. No one stopped him. No one could. Eyes turned away. A silence heavier than any scream took hold. He did not call her by her name. He called her girl. "Come here, girl." And she obeyed because in that world, refusal was not just disobedience. It was a gamble with death. She was not the first. She would not be the last. But for her, the visits did not end. They became a pattern. The creak of the big house floorboards above, the smell of tobacco and sweat, his shadow crossing the candlelight, his hand on her arm, his breath in her ear. She learned to leave her body without moving, to watch what was happening from somewhere just above herself, to let the moment pass through her like wind through grass. When it was over, she would lie there, staring at the ceiling, listening to her own heartbeat, and wondering why it was still there. The first time she realized she was pregnant, it came with no joy. Oh, there was no whispered sharing of good news, no planning for the future. Just a quiet, heavy dread. Some of the older women noticed before she said anything. They had seen it too many times. They tried to be kind in small ways, an extra portion of food when they could manage it, a hand on her back when she retched in the mornings, a palm pressed against her forehead, checking for fever. But kindness could only do so much. Kindness did not change ownership. The master did not acknowledge the pregnancy. To him, it was simple arithmetic. Another body, another asset. A child who would be born already belonging to him. The mistress, the wife, saw. How could she not? She saw the way he avoided looking at the young woman when they crossed paths. She saw the way the other slaves went too still when the girl entered a room. She saw in that swelling belly a mirror of all the things in her marriage that would never be said aloud. The day the baby was born, the sky was thick with clouds. The kind of clouds that made everything feel closer, lower, oppressive. The birth happened in one of the huts, away from the big house, with only other enslaved women present. No doctor, no priest, no witnesses with power. The child came into the world with a cry that sounded more like a question than a declaration. Tiny hands, skin a shade in between mother and father, eyes that flickered open only for a moment. For a brief instant, the mother felt something cut through the numbness, a sharp, unbearable tenderness. She held the baby, pressed it to her chest, and for one stolen breath, tried to imagine a different world. A world where this child could run under a sun that did not burn, where laughter was not something whispered, where the word master did not exist. Then the door opened. The master did not come. He sent someone else, a steward, a man whose job it was to carry out orders so that the master's hands could appear clean. He stood in the doorway, looked down at the infant, and saw not a human life, but a problem, a complication, a shameful reminder of what everyone already knew but few dared to speak. There are no surviving records of the words spoken in that hut. No one wrote down who cried first, or who begged, or who refused to beg. But later, in scattered testimonies and second-hand accounts, a single idea appears again and again. The child did not live long. Some claim the baby died of sickness within days. Others whisper that the steward, following unspoken orders, made sure the problem went away quickly. Others still say that it was the mother herself who, faced with the future that awaited that little body, made a choice that broke her in two. What is known is that the child was buried quietly. No coffin, no marker. Just a small patch of disturbed earth behind the quarters, under a tree whose roots would eventually wrap themselves around tiny bones. Life on the plantation did not stop. The field still needed working. The quotas still had to be met. The lash still whistled in the air when someone faltered. The young woman returned to her days as if nothing had happened. Only her eyes had changed. They were no longer simply tired. They were watchful, distant, as if she were always listening for something that others could not hear, Then weeks later, the master came calling again. The second pregnancy came faster. By now, rumors had started to circulate in that invisible network of whispers that existed beneath the surface of the plantation. Some said the mistress had confronted her husband, and that his response had been cold, dismissive. Some said that the priest in the nearby town had been told and had advised silence to protect the order of things. Silence became the most obedient servant. The second child was born in a similar way. Hidden, hushed. No record in the church books. No official acknowledgement. But this time, something in the mother had shifted. She had seen what awaited a child born into chains, especially a child caught between two worlds, blood of the master, body of a slave. She had seen how easily a life could be erased with a shrug. She understood with a painful clarity that this world had no place for her children except one of suffering. There is a story told generations later that on the night of the second child's birth, someone heard her speaking softly in the hut. Not to the midwives, not to any of the women helping her, to the child. She whispered of things the baby would never see. Rivers wide and free, skies without smoke, songs sung in a language older than the plantation. Then silence. What happened after is clouded by fear and time. But one thing is certain. The second small grave appeared not far from the first. By the time she was in her early 20s, the young woman had already buried more than most people could bear in a lifetime. Her body healed after each birth, but something inside her did not. It remained wounded, open, bleeding in ways no one else could see. And still, the visits from the master continued. His desire did not lessen. If anything, the taboo, the danger, the very scandal of it, seemed to make it stronger. He convinced himself that she wanted him, that her silence was consent, that her lack of resistance meant acceptance, not trauma. It was easier for him to believe that than to confront what he truly was. On nights when the mistress could no longer ignore the creak of the stairs, she would lie in her bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, hands clenched into fists so tight her nails dug crescents into her skin. Her prayers turned sour. Her faith cracked. Her heart filled with a hatred she did not know where to place. Society had given her a script. Be silent, be dignified, look away. She followed it. But inside, something black grew. The third pregnancy took a greater toll on the mother. Exhaustion settled in her bones like lead. Her eyes had lost the last traces of youth. Her laughter, if it had ever existed, was now just a vague memory. By this point, she was less a woman in the eyes of the master than a vessel that seemed to produce a problem he did not want to acknowledge. He began to drink more. Anger flickered beneath his charm. He grew harsher with everyone around him. The child came into the world in a storm. Rain battered the roof of the hut. Thunder rolled across the sky like the growl of something enormous. The women helping her worked in near darkness, lit only by flickering candles that seemed ready to surrender at any moment. The baby emerged, slick with blood and newness, and did what babies do. It cried, loudly, persistently, as if demanding an answer to a question much larger than this place. The sound carried further than usual, riding the wind, slipping through cracks, reaching ears that wanted, needed, to pretend nothing was happening. In the big house, the mistress heard it. She clutched at the sheets. The cry sliced through her composure like a blade. In the fields, a few workers paused, heads tilted, faces tightening just for a second before they forced themselves back into rhythm. They knew that looking too long, listening too closely, was dangerous. Some say that the child's cry woke something in the mother. Others say it broke something that was already barely holding together. The story that survived is not a legal document, not a testimony sworn before a judge. It is a legend carried in whispers, passed down, reshaped, but always carrying the same core. The woman took her child in her arms, wrapped in a cloth. She walked out into the night, barefoot, the mud cool under her feet. No one stopped her. Either because they did not see, or because they saw and understood that this was not a path anyone could divert her from now. She walked past the slave quarters, past the big house, its windows dark, its walls indifferent. Out toward the edge of the fields where the land dipped and a small copse of trees grew, a remnant of the forest that had once covered everything. She stood there for a long time, still as a shadow. Some say she spoke aloud, words no one was meant to hear. A bargain, a plea, a curse. Then, in the stories, she knelt. And once again, the earth received what the world above had refused to care for. The next morning, the child was gone. Officially, it never existed. But by now, patterns had become impossible to ignore, even in a place built on denial. 3 pregnancies, 3 infants, 3 disappearances. In another world, in another time. That might have been enough to spark an investigation driven by justice. Here it sparked one driven by something else. Fear. Not fear for the children. Fear of scandal. Fear of what others might say. Fear of facing the reality that the master of the house had fathered children with a slave again and again, only for those children to vanish, as if swallowed by the night. The mistress could no longer maintain the illusion. She demanded answers. The priest, when he finally allowed his conscience to outweigh his cowardice, asked questions in private. Neighbors whispered. Pressure built. Someone had to be blamed. The woman became the perfect vessel for that blame. She was powerless. She was already broken. And in the logic of that society, a slave woman was always suspect, always a potential embodiment of sin, temptation, and danger. Whispers hardened into accusations. Accusations hardened into charges. Murder? Of whose command? On that point, records fall silent. Some testimonies, heavily filtered through the biases of the time, claim she confessed, that she admitted to suffocating her own newborns one by one, rather than letting them live a life of chains. Others say her so-called confession was dragged out of her under torture, signed with a mark she did not understand. Some rare fragments found later in dusty archives hint at another possibility, that in her last days she refused to speak at all, that she met every question with the same unblinking stare, as if she had taken every word she might have said and buried them too, deep inside where no one could reach. The trial, if it can be called that, was a formality. She had no advocate, no rights, no one to argue that perhaps the true crime was not what she had done, but what had been done to her. The judges were men who shared the master's world, his values, his fears. A sentence was inevitable. Death. Before she turned 30, the woman who had been used, blamed, and erased was condemned to die. They chose hanging. Quick, public, and in their eyes, efficient. The day of the execution, the sky was clear. No storm this time. No clouds to hide what was about to happen. The enslaved were forced to attend. They were made to stand and watch, a living audience to the message the masters wanted to send. This is what happens when the order of things is disturbed. The gallows were simple: a beam, a rope, a stool. They brought her out, hands bound, feet dragging slightly. Her body was thin, marked by years of labor and childbirth. Her face in that moment carried no tears. Those who claim to have been there say that she looked not at the master, not at the mistress, not at the priest or the judges, but at the horizon, past the fields, past the hills, as if finally she was letting herself see a place beyond the boundaries of the plantation. Some say that just before the stool was kicked away, she opened her mouth and spoke one last sentence. What it was, no one can agree on. Some say she forgave. Others say she cursed. Others insist she only said a name, that of one of her buried children. What is undeniable is that, moments later, her body hung limp, swaying slightly in the noon sun. The master did not attend. He stayed in his house, drinking, pretending that this was justice and not the predictable end of a tragedy he had set in motion. The mistress watched from a distance, hidden behind a curtain. Her hands trembled, not from pity, but from the terrible realization that nothing had actually been fixed. The source of her humiliation had been eliminated, but the man who caused it walked free. The priest mumbled prayers, eyes down, soul compromising yet again. The enslaved looked on, and in their hearts, something hardened. A memory, a warning, a vow that this story would not vanish, no matter how forcefully the records tried to erase it. They buried her in an unmarked grave, not far, it is said, from the tiny mounds where her children lay. The earth received her too. Years passed, decades. Eventually, the plantation changed hands. Owners came and went. The slave trade was abolished. The chains were taken off, but the scars remained in the land, in the blood, in the stories. The big house began to crumble. Paint peeled. Windows shattered. Weeds pushed through cracks in the foundation. The gallows rotted away. The rope turned to dust. But the ground remembered. Locals in later generations began to speak of strange things around that old hill. Animals refused to graze too close to the line of trees where the small graves were said to be. Tools left overnight near that spot would be found moved by morning, half buried as if the soil itself were trying to pull them under. Some nights, when fog settled low and thick, people claimed to hear faint sounds from the direction of the ruins. Not chains, not whips, crying, not loud, not dramatic, soft, persistent, like the whimper of a child who has been crying for so long that the act has become mechanical. Others swore that if you stood there alone and closed your eyes, you could feel the weight of a gaze on your back. Not hateful, not vengeful, just present. As if someone was standing just behind you, waiting for you to speak a name you did not know. A few bold or foolish ones tried to spend the night there to prove that the stories were only that, stories. Most did not make it to dawn. They left in the early hours, faces pale, hands shaking, refusing to describe what had pressed into their dreams. One man, years later, said that in the middle of the night, he awoke to the feeling of small fingers closing around his wrist, holding on with a desperate strength. When he opened his eyes, there was nothing there. But on his skin, faint as breath, were the impressions of tiny hands. The legend evolved. Some said that the mother wandered the ground, searching for her children, unable to rest because she had both loved and harmed them. Others said the children themselves were the restless ones, their short lives demanding a witness. What no one could deny was that the place did not feel empty. Centuries later, when developers considered clearing the land to build something new, surveys were conducted. A team came with machines, maps, the language of progress. But their work slowed. Because as they dug test trenches and took soil samples, they began to find things. Fragments of bone, smaller than they should have been. Cloth fibers that had no business surviving that long, clinging stubbornly to the earth. Pieces of iron that looked like parts of shackles. Officially, the site was classified as historically sensitive. Unofficially, the workers demanded to be reassigned. Too many of them spoke of the same thing, of feeling watched, of tools slipping from their hands for no reason, of sudden, overwhelming waves of sadness that came from nowhere, forcing them to step back, to breathe, to blink away tears that were not entirely their own. One worker, a woman with a quiet demeanor and no patience for ghost stories, refused to return after her third day. When pressed, she finally said this: "Every time I put the shovel in, it felt wrong, like I was interrupting someone's sleep." The records of the plantation itself, the official ones, barely mention the woman. Her name, if it was ever written, is obscured, smudged, lost under layers of neglect. A clumsy handwriting here, a half-erased note there. Nothing solid. Nothing that can be held up and pointed to with certainty. But in the oral histories, in the stories told quietly in kitchens and on porches, often at night, she is very real. They call her different names in different tellings. Some name her after flowers that grow wild near the site. Others after the moon, after shadows, after silence. What remains consistent is this: she was young. She was enslaved. She bore her master's children. And before she reached 30, she had buried them all. Was she a monster? Was she a victim? Was she something more complex, something that languages, shaped by the powerful, still struggle to define? Her story refuses easy answers. Perhaps she believed that in taking those tiny lives, she was granting them a freedom this world would never allow. Perhaps she acted under orders, her hands forced, her will shattered. Perhaps madness took root in her mind, watered by grief and pain, until she could no longer distinguish mercy from horror. There is no neat conclusion. No moral cleanly wrapped in ribbon. No redemption arc neatly tied off. What there is a shadow. A shadow cast over the glossy images sometimes painted of the colonial past. A reminder that behind every elegant house, every ledger of profits, every statue and portrait, there were people whose names were not recorded, but whose suffering was vast. Tonight, as this story sinks into your thoughts, imagine the ground beneath your feet. Not just where you are now, but in all the places you have walked without thinking. Streets, parks, fields, foundations of old buildings. How many stories lie beneath them untold? How many lives reduced to dust? Their voices silenced, their choices judged only by those who never had to make them. Somewhere, on a forgotten hill where a plantation once stood, the earth still holds the shape of a young woman's last steps, the faint impression of small bodies laid down with shaking hands, the weight of a rope, the echo of a final exhale. And on certain nights, when the wind is right, and the world above grows quiet enough, the past rises just a little closer to the surface. Not as a scream, not as a spectacle, as a whisper that asks not for forgiveness, but for remembrance. Because sometimes the most terrifying stories are not those invented to frighten us, but those that actually happened. Stories of a world that decided some lives mattered and others did not. stories that were never meant to be told. You have heard one of them tonight. And once you hear a whisper like this, you cannot pretend the earth beneath you is just dirt anymore.